Great. Well, I think we'll get started and we'll allow the rest of the attendees to trickle in here as they make their way into the virtual room. So welcome again, everyone. My name is Nick Tedesco and I'm the president and CEO of the National Center for Family Philanthropy. We're really excited that you're joining us today for one of our community conversations. As a reminder, our community conversations are topical webinars on issues and trends in family philanthropy, and they're available to the field at large. These events are designed to lift up experts in the field, to challenge philanthropic families in their thinking and practice, and to share timely stories and strategies in the family philanthropy community. In today's conversation, we're really excited to hear from the Rauch Foundation of Long Island and how the foundation has played a unique role as a hub to forge relationships across local business, government, and media. The panelists will share their stories and illustrate the 5 principles for using research, relationship networks, advocacy, and targeted grants to open up blocked civic systems and address community needs at scale. We'll also hear how family foundations are positioned to foster collaboration and are positioned to lay the groundwork for future cross-sector partnerships. Before we begin, let me briefly share about our webinar technology. We want this webinar to be interactive, so please submit questions for the panelists, and you can do so at any time. To ask a question, please use the question box on the current slide. When sending in a question, if you wish to remain anonymous, please indicate that. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and a replay will be made available to all attendees. If you experience any technical issues, please reconnect to the technology or email jen.crino@ncfp.org. And as always, you're welcome to chat with us on Twitter about today's webinar using the hashtag #NCFPWeb. So with that being said, I'd like to briefly introduce our panel before we move into the discussion. Again, we are really honored to be joined by an esteemed group of individuals here today. We're joined by Nancy Rauch Douzinas, the president of the Rauch Foundation, Patrick Halpin, the chair of Suffolk County Water Authority, Kevin Law, partner and executive president of Tritech Real Estate Development Company, Gemma De Leon Lopresti, the commissioner of Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, and Katie Smith Milway, principal of Milway Media and a senior advisor of the Bridgespan Group. Katie will be moderating the conversation, and I will turn it over to her and give a big thank you to all our panelists and to all of you listening in. We hope it's a great conversation. So Katie, thank you for doing this, and over to you.
My pleasure. I'm just going to pull up the screen right now. There we go. And let's look in the slideshow view so you can, there we go, from the current slide. Okay, there we go. Can everyone see? Thanks for that great introduction, Nick. We're delighted to be here. And the big idea for the webinar today is really about how to use smaller grants, so how smaller family regional foundations can use their grant money to unlock big, big economic gains for their region. And as you said, it's through being really smart about using the money for research that can galvanize convenings, that can form the relationships that actually make things happen, and other small grant sort of incentives in the right places to really unlock public systems and public monies. So we really anchor the thinking today in 2 of the trends that Nick actually spoke to in December during the Future of Philanthropy webinar, a family philanthropy webinar, and that's funding recovery and resiliency. So a lot of this unlocking of public funds is really to help revive regions that have just been battered in the last year through the tangle of crises, health, racial, and economic, and collaboration. 2 big trends that have, that are combined in the cross-sector partnerships that we're going to talk about today. You met the cast of characters, which are all folks that collaborated on a very big cross-sector partnership we're going to talk about. And then we've got a few others that are in the works that are really exciting, that will help advance both economics and equity for Long Island, and I think prove as really good examples for other regions where family philanthropy wants to follow suit. So just to refresh our memories, we saw in COVID-19 that business, it really forced business, government, and philanthropy to combine forces very quickly to respond to community needs. So this is a picture of one of the more dramatic and well-publicized tri-sector collaborations that arose when the governor of Massachusetts combined forces with the Kraft Foundation, which scrambled a Patriots jet to go to China and pick up equipment, protective equipment for all of the hospitals across Massachusetts. And it happened quickly. It happened fast, and this is how we saw a lot of these needs addressed during COVID that were very punctual. But they did actually draw on long-standing relationships. It wasn't the first time that that the governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, had talked to the Crafts. So that's just something to put a pin on. The problem is, though, too often our region's systems are blocked and those relationships aren't in place, and it really stymies health and growth and progress where we need it. So as family foundations, they are in a really great position to pollinate the relationship networks across sectors and regions that can open up the system for growth. And we're going to talk about how this happened in Long Island today. And you've got the pollinators and the flowers on the panel. So it'll be really interesting to hear their stories. One of the issues that this group tackled was on Long Island, and it stimulated a very much needed recovery project, which was called the Third Track. And the Third Track was to get basically a commuter rail out to parts of Long Island that did not have good transit for reverse commuting into New York City, and for those working outside of Long Island to come to their jobs in Long Island. And that was creating a real issue in terms of jobs and out migration of young people, et cetera. So this was a big project. It was simmering for a long time, and it was really philanthropic action in the right places that helped bring together the coalition that made it happen ultimately. So there's 5 principles for what we're going to talk about. And by the way, I should mention it was a $2.4 billion project that came together with much smaller grants opening up the public funding. So there's 5 principles that the CEO of Rauch Foundation, Nancy Rauch Douzinas, who's going to be speaking in just a moment, has written about in Stanford Social Innovation Review, and we're going to talk about today. One is to listen without an agenda. So really that's the beginning of forming these partnerships, understanding where needs lie and where interests lie, et cetera. Build relationships before plans. So get the relationship network in place in order to be ready for the opportunity. Gather data before decisions. And that's really important if you want to galvanize folks that are coming at problems from different angles. Some neutral, objective, trustworthy data to highlight what the issue is and allow people to connect to it from whatever angle they come. Super important. And then really forming a hub, not a backbone. And this differentiates the kind of cross-sector alliances that we're going to talk about today, say from backbone organizations that are formed in the spirit of collective impact in communities, which are much more rigid, where a foundation might play a role or some other actor might play a role, and then in a really kind of spine and rib way connect the different organizations in a community to an action plan. The collaborations we're talking about are much more flexible and are able to spring up around issues without a lot of formal sort of scaffolding. But you do need a hub. And in this instance, the Rauch Foundation formed a hub, and then business could connect to that hub, government interests could connect, labor could connect, media could connect in ways that made sense for them to move forward their own constituencies toward the same goal, which in this first case we're going to talk about was getting a $2.4 billion rail track through to parts of Long Island that needed it. And then finally, with that in place, you're able to sprout issue-based collaboration. So we're going to talk today in the first instance about the Third Track, but we're also going to talk about some new collaborations that are sprouting around water access, around reviving Main Street, big issue right now for so many towns across the nation, and a great role for local philanthropy to make a difference. And we'll talk about it also through a lens of equity, because all of these issues have, there are folks that are more and less affected by each of the issues that we're going to talk about, and also energy. So some of these sort of backbone issues that really make a difference to communities' ability to be effective, to provide for the residents, and make it and be accessible to all who need to live there for their jobs and for families. So with that, just kind of brief overview of sort of the ideas. Let's turn now to the actual story. And the first part we're going to talk about is actually how Rauch started listening without an agenda. I'm going to ask Nancy, I'm going to stop sharing, and so you can see the speakers more clearly, and ask Nancy just to talk a little bit about how you came to the conclusion that you needed to stop doing and start just listening as you were trying to make strides in Long Island. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and I'm delighted to be sharing our story. The Rauch Foundation, just in terms of a little background, was founded in 1961 and was really until 1991 very much of a pass-through foundation. Big beneficiaries were Lehigh University and the YMCA. But at that point, the founders decided they really wanted to make more of a change in doing things, contributing more. So we hired staff, we brought non-family board members on, and I became president. And with that, we focused on Long Island, the early childhood area, and the environment. We also did work in Maryland. Anyway, this was a challenging time. We did some really interesting projects. We thought they were enormously creative, only to be beaten down by the problems of Long Island in terms of just too many jurisdictions. We could never take anything to scale. So it was really out of frustration. We said, what can we do? We put 10 years into grants like this. And at this point, we thought, well, let's start asking other leaders. Let's start asking people, what does Long Island need? What can we do to move things forward? And with that was the beginning of our listening. And we convened groups, cross-sector groups, business leaders, like you see here today, many leaders of nonprofits. And we talked about, like, how do we really become more of a catalyst for positive change? And what we heard was no more leadership groups. Long Island has too much of absolutely everything. And with this, they said, good facts, good information would really be helpful. Long Island tended to be connected either to New York City or to New York State, but there was no good information just on Long Island. So we said, well, that's an idea. Maybe we could do something about that.
And Gemma, you were at one of those early listening sessions. I think it was called Build a Better Burb. Can you tell us what it was like to be invited to just come and talk about, labor's issues on Long Island, and what you thought you'd get out of it and what you did get out of it?
Sure. At the time, I was a local union leader, and I was also the vice president of the Long Island Federation of Labor. And I remember the very first meeting, Nancy was convening that meeting. I remember Kevin Law was sitting next to me, kind of like trying to not to block my view, but so many, he was so polite.
We have him in his own square today, so you'll be okay.
He's very tall. And I remember it was so many different people in the room, and I really felt awed by the folks in the room, the diversity of their interests, but I really felt included. Nancy made a point to go around the room and really listen. And I could find with everything that I heard that there was some commonality, that we all needed to care for the region. And I felt that message would be compelling for our union's members.
Thank you. And Kevin, not to get too far ahead, but you took this same, I mean, it's sort of a listening breeds listening, and it's a technique that tends to get replicated. And you took this same spirit to, once there was some consensus around the third track being one of the shared concerns of those in many of these rooms where Nancy and others were listening, you took that same spirit of listening to trying to get form a coalition of action around the third track. Can you talk a little bit about that and the right track?
Yeah, sure, Kate. When I was a young boy, my grandmother used to tell me that God gives you 2 ears and 1 mouth because you should listen twice as much as you speak. And it's, a relevant point to our discussion here today, because people don't tend to listen. They like to talk. And when you listen, as Gemma said, you find very often some commonality, but 2, you always learn something, and you learn how to maybe do things better or differently, or collaboratively. And so yes, we did have this sort of a consensus by a lot of stakeholders on Long Island that this third track was very important to Long Island. And this third track was only a 10-mile track. It was a 9 1/8 mile track in the middle of the system, but it was very critical for redundancy, reliability, and to allow reverse commutation, which would then help our regional economy. And the project had been kicking around for almost 60 years. And so everybody knew there was merit to this. And every few years it would rise, and then it would immediately get shot down by NIMBYs. And every community has NIMBYs, and those are the ones who don't want anything in their backyard. So a consultant to the Rauch Foundation and a former mayor of Greenport, a village on the eastern end of Long Island, Dave Capel, and we went on this listening tour to some of the elected officials who had been pretty often thumping on their chest to say, not in my backyard, and they didn't want this project. So we actually sat down with them individually to listen to them, to actually listen to their concerns. And why the state senators were important was because they were in control of the New York State Senate and also control the financing. And so what we had found out was that they didn't really oppose the project themselves, but a lot of the mayors and a lot of the villages in their Senate districts opposed the project. And so they felt they were doing their duty to fight the project because the locals didn't want it. And then as we talked to more of them and more of the mayors, what we really found out was, again, they didn't really have a problem with the project, some of it, but they really didn't want to live through the construction of the project. And anybody who's gone through the renovations of a kitchen or a bathroom, you know how difficult it can be in terms of meandering around the house through that construction. But once the kitchen is done or the bathroom is done, you're very, very pleased and happy, and it was well worth it. And so we figured, we learned that we needed to help come up with a way that would reduce the footprint of this project and ease the impacts of construction. And that we also knew we needed to get some help from Albany, including our governor. And I'll save that for another question.
Okay, that's great. Well, so let's move on to the second principle, Nancy, which is really building relationships before you build plans. So you listened, you drew in people from labor like Gemma, from business like Kevin. We haven't heard from Patrick yet, but Patrick came from being at the time he was in politics. And I'd just be interested in how you started to forge relationships out of the listening.
Sure. Well, one of the first things we did was to go on what we called learning trips. And it was interesting. I had the opportunity to meet with Susan Beresford just as she was becoming president of the Ford Foundation. And I was talking to her just about what could we do on Long Island. And she suggested going to other parts in the United States and that had some relevance for us. And taking a group along, taking a group of different people, other foundations, nonprofits, government, whoever you could get, small group, and learn. And that's what we did. We went to places, Milwaukee. We went to Louisville, Kentucky. We went to Boston. And it was a wonderful opportunity for people just to hang out together, to be together, but also see firsthand with your eyes what other places were doing and the creative things that were going on. So that was a really good beginning for building relationships.
Yeah. And then Kevin, you took the same idea to figuring out how to put relationships together around the third track project, which again emerged out of this listening tour and the research.
Yes. So what we did was we got Governor Cuomo, interested in the project. But we also warned him of the 50+ years of political controversy surrounding this project. And he liked the challenge, but he needed some local support. And so for those not too familiar with Long Island, we're a region of 3 million people in 2 counties with 13 towns, 2 cities, and about 100 villages throughout 100 different communities. So we're very balkanized. And we're also balkanized between the business community, the not-for-profit community, and the labor community. And what Long Island was doing very well was nobody was really working together or collaborating together. And so we decided to put together a coalition with the business community, with the labor community, and with the not-for-profit community. And what we did was we got stakeholders from all those different sectors, all types of businesses, all types of not-for-profits, including environmental organizations, and all types of labor, because this was going to be a multi-billion-dollar project, and this was also going to create a lot of jobs for them, in addition to being very good for businesses who would benefit from a stronger economy. And so we put together a coalition of those 3 sectors, and we cleverly came up with a name, since we were working on what was called the third track, and we called this the Right Track Coalition, to get Long Island on the right track. And it was loosely affiliated. We didn't incorporate, but we had Nancy and myself and one of the leaders of the labor community, and we sort of co-chaired it. And what we did was we built this coalition of support to be to give the governor and elected officials who had courage to support the project, to give them some cover and backup. But more importantly, what typically happens in communities whenever there's a project, a controversial project, the ones who are most vocal are usually the ones who are most opposed to the project. And they would drown out the majority of the public speaking opportunities at these meetings. And so what we decided to do with this coalition was we would go to all these public hearings, public meetings, and we would pack the room with supporters, which would give the decision makers some courage to do the right thing and be supportive of the project. And it never happened before on Long Island. And it actually worked. We would get hundreds of people in support of the project down, and we would drown out the folks who were opposing. And usually it was always the other way around. So the Right Track Coalition was really the first time that Long Islanders really pulled together to come out and support something that was good, rather than just raise their hands and say, well, this can't be done. It hasn't been done in 50 years. It's not going to be done now. And we proved them wrong.
So Patrick and Gemma, can you talk about how your constituencies connected into the Right Track, if so, and how? Go ahead, Gemma. Or Patrick, go ahead. You're actually on mute.
Still
on mute.
Unmute. Okay, I am unmuted. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me. This is terrific, and I've known Nancy for a long time, and I love hearing her story because one of the parts of the secret sauce was Nancy Rauch Douzinas, in that she was one of those people who you just can't say no to. So when she asked, can we get together for coffee, or would you come and talk to us? I want to pick your brain. She was able to put together a very interesting cross-section of Long Islanders. Kevin Law laid out the geography of Long Island and the governance of Long Island very, very well. I'm not going to repeat that. But what is important to understand these villages, and there are 100 of them, believe it or not, there are even more school districts, but that's a whole nother story. The villages, for the most part, as Long Island grew, were located along the Long Island Railroad, and they became the hubs. So these little villages had an enormous amount of influence and clout, and they asserted themselves because, as we all know, and I'm a recovering politician. I was county executive of Suffolk County, before that a state legislator and a county legislator. You really don't want to have a whole group of people, whether they be in a little village, who are adamantly opposed to what you do. Now, what's fascinating, Kevin alluded to it, this goes back a long time, 60 years, but it was first supported by Mario Cuomo, then George Patek. I'm ticking off the governors, Elliott Spitzer, Governor Patterson, and then Governor Andrew Cuomo. They would put this in their budget. The Long Island Railroad wanted it, as Kevin said. It was needed. It was necessary. But then what happens is the horse trading. And when the Assembly and the Senate and the governor got together to talk about the budget for the MTA, the senators from Long Island were very powerful, especially in Nassau County. They would pull it out. And nobody was there to fight for this. Nobody was there to do the work you just heard. But this is something that evolved because the Right Track Coalition became this coalition, became the catalyst. And the thing that I think about often is that there were a lot of benefits for those villages. So, for example, that track for many, many years had a lot of at-grade crossings. There were terrible deaths, including a death of a daughter of a state senator going back, and he made it his business that he was going to try to eliminate those. All of those, the governor said when he was talking to the mayors, and with Governor Andrew Cuomo, is, look, what do you need? That kind of conversation at a high level, peer-to-peer, supported by the Right Track Coalition, hadn't occurred. Everybody assumed that the benefits would be obvious. But as we all know, politics is local. And frankly, most politicians are more worried about their next election as opposed to the long-term benefit. But that catalyst, that group, were able to work through the issues, get to where there's a common set of facts, and then support the process necessary to go from saying, yeah, it would be great if it happened, but to overcome the objections. And they did it very successfully.
That's great. And Gemma, your union members played a role too. You want to talk a little bit about how they connected into the Right Track Coalition?
Sure. For organized labor, the third track has always been important, particularly for the building trades, because that meant, shovel-ready jobs. And so for a long time, they've wanted this project to go forward, and it was stalled for decades. But I think what Nancy accomplished and what Kevin Law spoke about is that it really began to appeal to a much wider union audience because it affects, for my local union in particular, we represented workers in the manufacturing and retail and food service industries. And the employers in some of those industries would often say to us, we can't attract enough workers on Long Island. And we have many employees that come in from New York City, and the transportation is just awful. Can't you get us more workers? And so, it was helpful to those unionized workers. It was helpful to our members who often work odd shifts or are trying to get to work on time, and there are just not enough trains. So it made a lot of sense for a much wider labor audience.
And I think I understood that at some of these rallies where Kevin was trying to bring positive voices, that your union members became those positive voices. Is that right?
Yeah, I recall at a time there was one incident I can recall is that there was a senator who was very much against it, and he was seen, distributing leaflets against this coalition, this project. And so we were able to get a group of union members and union staff to go and start distributing our own flyers about why it's great for the.
One thing I can attest to, other than the governor, the labor groups really had the muscle to make this happen, and all of them were extraordinarily important.
And I think it's really unique, Nancy, that as a foundation, you were reaching out to labor and reaching out to some of these constituencies that we don't find always right on top of the radar of foundations. So at this point, you've invested in some listening, like convenings, probably, I'm guessing, sandwiches and drinks so people can get together. You invested in some trips to go to Milwaukee. But I mean, these are small outlays compared to what was at stake, which is $2.4 billion of rail track. What was your next investment? I think the next principle we're going to talk about is data before decisions. So can you talk about your investment in research?
Yes. Well, the investment in research came way before the success of the third track. You have to realize the first index came out in 2004. The third track was accomplished, Kevin, what year? 2017, 18? I mean, so it was a long-term investment. I think there were other successes along the way. The third track was the biggest by far, but the data element, very powerful, just like the unions, very powerful. But the data, it was what the people were asking for, the leaders in the beginning. Give us good data. Mm-hmm. And we had every year, we would report on various indicators, health, environment, education, and we would track them over time.
And can you just talk about, I mean, some foundations might decide to work with a university or something to do this, but you actually set up an operating grant and an operating organization. Tell us about that decision.
Well, that decision, it was not our intent to run this as an operating grant, but what we realized after we went around and talked to various very good universities, there was really another agenda for most universities to brand this as their own. And we thought we just felt we were in a sweet spot that we were not allied with anyone in particular. So we made the decision that it was worth, we committed to 1 year, really 1 year at a time. And, I think that was the right decision because of the unique spot that foundations really have in being seen as, free agents in a sense, really having the community good at their heart.
And the branding became Long Island, correct? The branding actually became the region, yeah.
Right.
The other thing that was interesting is you set up a media relationship. So not only did you get the research done, but you got it out in bold ways. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. No, we realized early on, we did hire PR assistants, and that was very important. In fact, the first year, we actually got into the New York Times because the big story was Long Island was losing its 18 to 34-year-olds at 5 times the national average. So right there, everybody paid attention. And, that got us started. We needed PR help throughout the 15 years. We did try to communicate in very different ways. I had an article that would appear in local papers called What Every Long Islander Should Know. And we also communicated with cartoons, with infographics, we did some very creative videos too. Every year we would have an annual presentation of the new information, and it really became, became part of what people expected. What's new about Long Island?
And didn't you also have a relationship with Newsday, your local major paper?
That relationship, really, we would always give them a briefing, but that relationship really came at the very end when it
interesting.
was, yes, when
Okay.
Newsday, we had a proposal, their proposal was the one we accepted. And for the past 3 years, we have funded Newsday, the local paper, to continue their nonprofit called Next LI.
So essentially this research report on the well-being of Long Island has an extended life because it's now found a new home. But
Yes.
before it did, you had an advisory group. And I want to ask Patrick to talk a little bit about having been one of the advisors for the Long Island Index. And at the time you were in your county supervisor role, I believe.
Right. Yeah, so it was very important. Look, as an elected official and as a regional elected official in a place that's very balkanized, it was very important to get island-wide information about critical issues. Nancy talked about the flight of young people from Long Island, but there were also index reports on the housing, the lack of affordable housing. They also came up with recommendations. A lot of that had to do with building it around transit hubs. And she brought good information from the area in and around the metro, the Washington metro area, about how they went about it as the commuter system there expanded into the suburbs. There was good information in there about the environment and water quality. And that index became a basis, not just for me as one elected official, but all elected officials to look at it and say, okay, what part of this is mine? What part of this can I address? At least that's the way I thought about it. But there was never a question about the quality of the research and the data that they provided. So again, we get back to this point where, we could argue about our opinions, but we're not going to argue about the facts. Some people still want to argue about the facts, but the facts in this case were the facts.
And I
And
think
they got a lot of attention. Yes.
The people, going back to the relationship piece relationship network piece we were talking about in the last point, that was an attraction for being part of this, you mentioned.
Absolutely. I mean, look, we all spend a lot of time on committees that frankly are kind of trying to reinvent the wheel, or they are, we're just kind of spinning our wheels. What I found very attractive was that there was a need here, a regional need. By the way, there were also subsections to it that would be more regionally specific, existed. And the Rauch Foundation said, we're prepared to do this, and here's how we're going to approach it. We're modeling it after some other communities that have done similar things. And that immediately got my attention. And it's like, not only how can I help, how can I be a part of this?
And some of the other, Gemma, were you on this as well?
Yes, I was also an advisory member of the index.
So tell us about some of the other people you had a chance to meet with monthly and what you learned.
I met Larry Levy from Hofstra there, the members of the leadership at the Cold Spring Harbor Labs. There were people from academia, there are people from other aspects of labor, there are business groups.
What about North Shore LIJ?
North Shore LIJ, yeah.
One of the biggest health systems in America now.
Yeah. It was really miraculous having all those folks in the room, and there was mutual respect, no arguing. We were all really wanted to care for the future of Long Island. We all have that in common.
Sorry, what is LIJ?
That's
It's now called Northwell.
Northwell.
Those were
huge
two,
HMO, right? A
yeah,
huge hospital network?
it is the largest healthcare system, one of the largest in America now. There were two healthcare groups, two hospital groups on Long Island, North Shore and Long Island Jewish. They merged. Yeah. I have to keep up with their branding. They are now Northwell.
Yeah,
I just want to put a pin on the fact that somehow this research project has attracted, it sounds like, the biggest brains on Long Island. So and a diversity of representation. So you had real diversity as well as depth Cold Spring Harbor being a top research facility, and Hofstra. I mean, these are pretty busy people that were coming together. Nancy, how did you manage to make that happen?
But Nancy, let me interrupt. You also had community people like a
Right,
race.
that's what I
racist.
wanted to say. We had
Yeah,
community
Various
people
nonprofits too.
like Elaine Gross from Erase Racism, because segregation is a big issue on Long Island. One we were very concerned with and still are as far as education. We had Hispanic representation too. So how did, well, it was in a sense, we created, I guess, a small group to begin with and then added selectively, and each person you brought would bring connections to other people. So it was quite organic. We did not, we should say, no elected officials currently in office were allowed to be on the committee.
So we had a question come in that we may as well just take right now because it fits this part of the conversation about the fact you have such a diversity of folks in the room. Surely there must have been some disagreements, and how did you work through those?
Of course. Well, usually just one-on-one. And the thing is, in the beginning, you could say people might have been more tentative. But what can I say? I think people felt they got more out of it. Elaine Gross, who represents Erase Racism, she had, she might not have been satisfied with everything she heard, but she could speak her opinion and it was listened to and valued. I don't really recall, I mean, I've been in other groups when there's a lot of tension, but this one had a camaraderie about it, because I think people believed in the cause. I mean, you have good information, you have people from different sectors, and
yep.
And we also tried to make it
Nancy,
fun.
Nancy, I
Yeah.
think the hardest part was honing down the focus every year for the index reports.
Because
that
you
was
gathered
remarkable.
so much data about so many topics to figure out what was the one
know.
bright line you wanted to draw that year. Yeah, I can imagine.
Well, what we did really was, how can we build on our assets? That was the motto. So, the third track, that was one of Long Island's assets. It's downtown's one of its assets. The innovative economy, the research labs we have here, Cold Spring Harbor, Brookhaven National Laboratory, terrific university, those are assets. So you're always thinking, how do you build on your assets? But we were very aware of what the problems are, and we did a number of reports on education. They're much harder to get traction on. And we continue to work on education and equity in education, but it's even a longer haul.
Well, we did hear about that there's even more school districts than towns and villages. So that's, I can imagine there's a lot to pull together there. That kind of naturally segues us into the fourth principle, which is building a hub that different spokes of interest and constituents can connect into. And so in a way, the neutrality and the fact base that you were developing through this Long Island Index became part of the validation of Rauch as a hub for different organizations to connect into that wanted to see good things happen in the region. And maybe talk a little bit about your philosophy of being a hub, Nancy. And then I'd like to ask Kevin about the way he connected Long Island business into it.
I should say that I'm a community and clinical psychologist by training, very versed in general systems thinking. And, I brought that all to this adventure, let's say. I was also very influenced by reading Paul Ilvesacher's piece called Small Can Be Effective. And he really talks about the power small foundations, family foundations have to be conveners. And that was like number one, that we were legitimate as a convener. And I would just say to other foundations, that's a power you possess. you're seen as not having an agenda.
By the way, I should mention there's a tribute and trove of Ylvisacker thinking on the National Center for Family Philanthropy site. So those listening that are interested, you can click in. We'll show it in resources at the end, but his thinking is permeated.
Yes, the other thing he also said is that you have the power to speak truth. You have the power to speak truth to power. And I think that's very true, that you're seen as unbiased and credible. So I would just,
yeah. Well, you know, the link actually to that trove is just appeared in the chat. So anybody who wants to grab it, thank you to Jason Bourne and Jen Carino from NCFP for putting up there. And I do, you know, this small to big is exactly the story of that we're telling today. Kevin, how did you connect into the hub that Nancy was describing?
Well,
and you were at the time were the head of the Long Island Business Association, or the Long Island Association, which was a business association.
Correct. And, you know, Patrick said it earlier, you know, we really got to give credit to Nancy and the Rauch Foundation. There's so many different players and organizations and sectors on Long Island, but we didn't really have an honest broker of information and data. And because if it was information that just came from the business community, people would say, oh, they have their particular agenda. And if it just came from labor, the people would say it just came from their perspective. And what Nancy and the Long Island Index did was really provide good hard facts that people could buy into and wanted to buy into. And so, you know, it's very important to have that good data. And again, you know, kudos to the Rauch Foundation, because, you know, they were focused primarily on social service, educational issues for the bulk of their early years. And for them to stick their neck out and get behind a big infrastructure project that would attract business, labor, and elected officials, and including environmentalists, to get behind it. That was, you know, it was really impressive and hadn't been done before. And so certainly they built the regional hub, and all these spokes bought into it. So it was relatively easy.
You know, we just had a question from the audience, and maybe Gemma, you can talk about how you answer the question, and all of you can, but also then talk about how labor connected into the hub. The question is, were all of you as panelists, were you also in some way grantees of the Rauch Foundation? So was some of the family feel because you were being funded by the Rauch Foundation?
On behalf of labor, I don't believe any labor
No.
was funded.
And the Long Island Association was not funded by the Rauch Foundation either.
And nor your political campaigns, Patrick?
No, not a penny. Not
So
a penny.
really, I mean, this is a testimony to the power of the data and this idea of research bringing together a region.
There
I
were
think
some
Elaine
grantees.
there were a few grantees, like the
There were.
nonprofits. Yeah, a few grantees that were present, like Erase Racism. Gemma, tell me about how labor connected into that. Like, what was the way you saw your special role?
You can really look at it from two perspectives. From the perspective of the working families, regardless of whether or not they were union members, they sort of have the experience that the index was putting into its data, but it was anecdotal. So working people have issues with housing, with education, with equity. So the index really took those experiences of everyday working people who struggle every day on Long Island, and put it and condensed it and put it in a way that everyone could understand. The other perspective you can look at is, how can you get that data to the hands of the average Long Islander, the average working family, and show, and so that they will no longer be part of the NIMBY problem, and show how this is a joint problem, that this affects working people, this affects the economy, this affects housing, the education system here. So from those two angles, it really tied into every aspect of workers, not just workers in the labor movement.
And you said it was a great way for you to be positively engaged, that so often labor ends up with, you know, with a beef, and that's how it becomes known. But this was a way for you to really positively engage with the region. which I thought was
Absolutely. Very often when you read about something with labor, it's about a strike or a work issue. And this was something that we could collaborate with so many other members of our community in a positive way towards really something that was going to be for the greater good. And I
yeah.
think that was really resonated with a lot of labor leaders as well.
And Patrick, anything to add about, as a politician, how you connected into this sort of hub of collaboration?
Well, I'm an ex-politician, but we're all recovering. We're all in recovery. No, I think we've covered it. I think
Okay.
that the beauty of this is that what was assembled were a group of people who said, we care deeply about our community. We care deeply about our region. So we had that common thread, and we were all willing. And by the way, when I got actively involved, of course, I knew Nancy when I was elected, I was out of office. So I was looking channel, my interest and my passion for. And when we talk about a region like Long Island, this was something that resonated with me deeply.
Okay, well, we had a little burst of questions we're just going to deal with quickly. One was, how much of the how did the 2.4 billion break down, and did Rauch put money in that pot? Answer to that, I know, is no. So really all of the investments from Rauch were around this research and the convenings and things like that aren't big tickets, but super important glue to the process. But the rest of it, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin and Nancy, but I believe it broke down between state and county, right? Is that correct?
No, it was pretty much all funded by the state.
All state. Okay.
And capital construction. And I'm happy to report, because I now serve on the board of the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, that oversees the Long Island Railroad. This project is on time and on budget and will be done by the end of this year, for something that had been talked about for 60 years. That is usually unheard of in government, for something to be on time and on budget.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We had another question we'll quickly work with, which is just to re-emphasize the difference between a hub and a backbone. And a backbone, for those of you who are familiar with the literature around collective impact, it's usually a pretty tightly formed coalition of organizations in a city, in a place, that tackle a specific issue, like getting kids from cradle to college, or lowering crime, or lowering unintended pregnancy, or some real objective for a town or a city or a region. And then everyone has a kind of assigned role, and the backbone collects the data, and the backbone keeps the schedule and keeps things moving and reports out and convenes. And so, but it's a fairly organized, with a timetable kind of initiative. The hub, which Nancy is describing, it isn't in lockstep. In fact, the Right Track wasn't its own nonprofit. It was just another coalition that formed around the work that Nancy was doing. So the hub is much more of a center where folks can connect in time and in space and in the way their constituents want, but you're not committed for the long term. You're committed for as long as your constituents find it useful to be a part of it. And it also allows you to use those relationships, those spokes around the hub, for a variety of initiatives. So we're going to actually move to that right now, because the fifth point is around sprouting initiatives. Once you've got this relationship network in place, the hub and the spokes that can get the wheels going on other things a region needs. So having kind of got the government owning the right track and the third track, Rauch and all these panelists are now turning to other big issues for Long Island. And I think it would be great to start maybe actually with one that I think is on the minds of many people across the United States right now, given the economic recovery issues we face, which is reviving Main Street. So let's talk about that. We've only got 15 more minutes or so. So let's make sure we hit that one. And then there's some issues that relate to reviving Main Street that are their own initiatives we'll talk about. Kevin, do you want to kick it off on that one?
Sure. You know what, back in the 60s and 70s, when big super malls shopping malls were popping up throughout the country,
Mhm.
That devastated a lot of downtowns because the malls became a new type of downtown, an indoor downtown. And many of them, not all, but many of them sucked the life out of downtowns. And the downtowns had to reinvent themselves and be different than the shopping malls. And many of them did. But last year, once COVID hit, and although a lot of towns had been taking some steps to recover, the pandemic really decimated a lot of the small businesses in the downtowns. You know, they couldn't work remotely. They either were in their shop or store and had people, you know, coming in, or they were losing that business, especially when it comes to restaurants and stores like that. Some adapted, you know, and learned how to have a website and do some curbside, retail. But many of them, you know, small businesses, they don't have a big HR department. They don't have an IT department. You know, the owner is the bookkeeper, the custodian, and the shopkeeper. And so a lot of them were decimated, and there's a big focus now on helping the downtowns. I think the federal government has tried to help the smaller businesses in downtown with various different programs. And now there's this whole new focus on let's revitalize our downtowns. People like walking in their downtowns. You don't need to have a car. You can walk from store to store, shop to shop, and they're active. They're fun. There could be theaters, you know, antique stores, you know, restaurants, outdoor dining, which really grew a lot last year. And more people are interested in living in downtowns. They may not want to be in big cities or big skyscrapers, but they're okay in a 4 or 5 story multifamily housing with amenities located near a train station, walking distance to a downtown, which allows them to come back and forth to the city or into their own downtown. So that's where our focus is now, and that's where my new focus is going to be. And a lot of the downtown interest is because of the work that Nancy and the Long Island Index did about the importance of downtowns, not only for job creation, but just in terms of an asset to the community.
So let's hear from Nancy about the role. I mean, Nancy, I know you have a report coming out very soon about historic downtowns and the role that philanthropy, business, and government can play in their revival. But tell us a little bit about the philanthropy side of it and how you envision this next initiative, cross-sector initiative springing up and making change.
Sure. Well, I should say that the research report that we've sponsored on downtowns was really done internally. Our research director from the Index has stayed on with us as a consultant, and she's managed this report on the downtowns, which the research itself was outsourced. But what we did is what we did every year with the Long Island Index. We would take the report and present it to each of the county executives in a private session before the report went public. This was, very respectful of the politicians and the leaders, giving them the heads up, giving them things to think about. And we did that again this year. Then some of the group actually went on and presented in front of one of the county executives' Economic Development Committee. So that part has already taken place. We've also offered, we're not offering money at all, but we're offering assistance, introductions, whatever we can in terms of added research. That's going on. The report is due to be released in a week or so. It's something, when we talk about assets, which was really a lot of our research looked at assets. Downtowns were a huge asset. So, we're continuing to work on that. And I should say that the collaboration, we don't have the Index Advisory Committee, but we have a kind of partnership that's been with Kevin at the Long Island Association, and with Newsday, who took over the index. So we're still in there, not running things the way we used to, but, and that's good. But we're still players. And I think it's very, very rewarding to see what has happened. And that's part of our motivation in trying to tell other foundations that there's a sweet spot to be found there.
And as having been privileged with a sneak peek at the report, there were some really specific places where foundations could do small grant programs to bring in the arts to fill empty storefronts until they could rent them out, and to ensure Wi-Fi for small business, and a whole variety of particularly corporate foundations could do that, and a whole variety of places where grants, smaller grant programs could make a big difference. So I just would say, everyone on the call, stay tuned, because we can make the report available through the National Center for Family Philanthropy when it comes out, or at least the press release, so you can get to it easily. Now, the other piece of these, of vibrant downtowns is obviously some of the utilities that it takes to keep a downtown going. So maybe, Patrick, you can talk a little bit about the initiatives springing up around water access.
Yeah, well, we all know that water is essential. In the case of water, as I mentioned before, it's kind of a tale of two counties. Most of Long Island was developed at post-World War II, but obviously the westernmost county, Nassau County, closer to New York City, had more development. As Suffolk County was more farmlands, and after World War II in the early 50s, the Suffolk County Water Authority, which is a public benefit corporation created by the state legislature, not-for-profit, was created. And it provides water to most of Suffolk County, 1.25 million people. In Nassau County, it's a different story. There are over 40 little water districts and companies, some of them, a couple of for-profit, many of them are run by villages. Yet we all get our water from the same place, which are underground aquifers. Both Nassau and Suffolk get their water exclusively from underground aquifers. Now, while we have plenty of water, the big challenge is the quality of water. And those are regional problems. Those are regional issues. So on one hand, we have a working model of what really the whole island should be. And I would venture to say that with the help of the foundation and the work that's being done in terms of thought leadership, there's a lot of understanding that we just can't keep doing things the same way, especially in a part of Long Island, Nassau County, that is so densely populated. They've created new, very rigorous standards for emerging contaminants, PFOA, PFOS, they call them the forever chemicals, and 1,4-dioxane. All of the treatment for that is very expensive. So for many of these smaller water providers, they just simply don't have the customer base to pay for it and get it up and going. So there's
what has been the philanthropic angle into surfacing these issues? And
again, it goes back to the heart of what the index is about, which is, here are a common set of facts. Here are the challenges. Here's where we are. Here's where we need to be. And here are some ways that we should be convening and figuring, and the next steps are to convene and figure out how to make that happen. But we're at a point now, which is a tipping point for our region, because we're all in it together. And again, water is vital to everybody. It's where that is the next opportunity. But like a lot of things, it's not going to be easy. But having a common set of facts and an honest broker and convener will go a long way.
So we actually had a question come up about facilitating these convenings around tricky issues. Nancy, the question was, do you do that yourself as the hub spokesperson, or do you bring in neutral facilitators? And then my question related to what Patrick has just described is, in situations where there's another entity pushing forward kind of an initiative, do you ever come in as one of the neutral, honest brokers to help bring it forward to the public?
I don't, as far as negotiations, I really provide information, data, make introductions, connect people. That's the primary role, I'd say.
So at your listening convenings and at the, the right track, do you have hired facilitators, or are you, no?
No, it's the discussion, no.
So one of your staff are facilitating the discussion?
You mean, well, it depends what meeting you're talking about. If you're talking about when we convened the index committee, I always ran that.
You ran that, okay.
I ran that.
I think that's what the question was aimed at.
Yes, I did.
Got it.
Together with the research leader we had too for the project.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we've just talked about reviving downtowns, getting the water access to make sure people can live in these downtowns and bring life to them. Gemma, you've been working with a sort of nascent coalition now on the island to bring clean energy, another real need for towns to be revived and vibrant. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and the philanthropic angle?
Yeah. Organized labor is working with a cross sector of other organizations, including the energy industry, environmentalists, even academia, because you have to train all the workers to be able to work on those wind farms. But particularly the building trades is excited to be embarking on this. I know Suffolk Community College, where I'm a trustee, is gearing up to train the workers. I think there are numerous other academic institutions that are going to be involved. I believe Hofstra, Stony Brook. So that's sort of an exciting other huge regional project to bring clean energy to the island. But I think one that I'm working on that sort of relates to rebuilding downtowns is we do have pockets. Many of the inner city problems have come to Long Island and other suburbs. And we have pockets of poverty and inequity. And so one of the projects that I'm working with the Justice Department, they have a community service division, and working with Larry Levy from Hofstra School of Suburban Studies, who I met through Nancy. We want to address some of the racial tensions that are existing in these communities. And that involves mediation, being able to have facilitated dialogue, working with the police, clergy, and other community members to address those racial tensions that very often affect the economies of these sort of blighted downtowns, and really kind of leave it in a sense of stagnation. And it's become even more. They've had even more challenges, obviously, during the COVID months or year. So that's
the bottom line is that the coalition that we used to get the third track done. Everybody was excited with the process and the results. And we now know we could form similar coalitions to address the water issues that Patrick talked about, to address our energy challenges, including taking advantage of our offshore wind industry and the jobs that will be created. And again, that's a coalition that brings business, labor, environmentalists together. And then to address some more social issues here on the island, whether it's poverty or systemic racism. And it's a neat way to address challenges by bringing people together who try to advance their goals based on independent data from folks like the Rauch Foundation. So that's why there's a role for the not-for-profit foundations, and they get business, labor, and other sectors working together. And it is a model that can be used.
And you're really speaking to an image that Nancy has created in an article that I believe is going to be available on the blog. I think Jen Carino may have already put it up, called Seeding the Ground for Tri-Sector Alliances to Address Crises. And this notion of seeding, as you say, Kevin, has actually blossomed lots of different kinds of initiatives. And it's almost like this original third track and right track effort has sent out rhizoids, so you've got another coalition forming around the various issues we just talked about. And that's very exciting. Nancy, there was two last questions that you could probably help us with. One was, is there a communication platform that you've used to keep all the piece parts together and informed? Or do you only, do you just rely on meeting in person? or on Zoom calls, I guess?
Well, I'm not the person to ask about that. The director of the Index project, she managed the communications and made sure that everything was available on our website and that. So I could ask her that question. I just can't answer it.
But that's a
we
good
did-
point. You do have a stash on the website of all of
Yes,
the
it still exists. Yes,
yeah,
the Long
all of
Island
the
Index.
reports, all of the fun infographics, the cartoons
Right.
really brought things to life and made people pay attention. So you did have sort of as a hub, you were the repository too of all of the collateral around these ideas. The
Yes.
other question was it hard to build support within the foundation's board to spend money on these things? Did they get it?
Yes, it was. Not everybody got it. And even, family members didn't particularly get it all the time. But I think I did have support of most of the board. I did have the support of my uncle, who actually, he had said to me, well, I'm going to leave my estate to the foundation depending on what it does. And he became a real believer and very shrewd thinker. And we still have his colleague who's 95, who's still on the board. Another very good, who was very involved with the Index. So yes, a good part. It was not a slam dunk. And it was also, it's something that not everybody understands.
Right.
So
So if they don't, you can use this article Nancy's written now for Stanford Innovation Review that I think is a great way to explain it. Last two questions and then we're at time. Does New York or Long Island have an active program affiliation with the National Main Streets program as you tackle this next thing?
There's some towns that do. I know Oyster Bay is connected. So I think it's town by town.
Okay.
But there is a connection in Oyster Bay for sure.
And then the last question was about COVID recovery and COVID issues. And we all know there were lots of cross-sector collaborations around COVID, including the one I mentioned with Charlie Baker, but many just on a local town basis to get lunches to kids, who are eligible for lunch programs, but not at school, to get masks to, hospital workers and essential workers and that sort of thing. Any advice right now for other towns and other philanthropies that want to bring together the various sectors to help in COVID recovery, Nancy, as a closing point?
Oh, well, I think partnering with your community foundation is a good way to go. We did some of that in the very beginning with our learning trips, and that included, if you can get together with some of the other local foundations, that's a good way. And usually your community foundation has a little bit more of an in to different, varied organizations. So I would suggest that.
That's great. Well, we do need to close out. The final point we want to land on is all of this de-risks grant making, because you've spread the risk across multiple parties. There's multiple owners of the initiative. And that was a third trend that Nick spotted in 2020, is the notion of de-risking grant making. And we just felt like this was a great example of one way to approach that, as well as economic recovery and collaboration. So thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful. Panelists, thank you for your stories and for sharing your wisdom.